In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. Conversation today is about a particular phrasing in the Declaration of Independence. The way that in the context, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And you were particularly interested in having a conversation about the phrase, the inalienable right of the pursuit of happiness, correct?
That's correct. So, yeah, I think that you and I, a number of different times, have had uh, disagreements on certain aspects of things. And I think it stems from that particular phrase. I think all of us, you and I included, agree that people's lives should be protected. We should all have our freedom, our liberty. Sometimes diverges what it means for the government to provide the opportunity for the pursuit of happiness. One example I've given to you a couple of times is we were talking once about internet ads, and we were talking about how it's difficult for people, and mail would be another one that I think we've talked about a few different times, where people in rural and sometimes poor areas don't have access to, without the government's assistance, wouldn't have access to mail. And sometimes the government provides incentives, subsidies, other things to help people get access to internet. And I said, well, that's fine. They could move if they really want that stuff. He said, well, what if they can't move? What if they're too poor? And I said, it seems strange to me that we'd be so, for example, you can send a letter to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, the same as you can in New York City. Or if you're in New York City, send it across the city. And to me, it should be cheaper in those areas where it's more populated, because you're not sending you can send a huge truck full of letters to New York City because there's so many people there. Whereas in a small area, you only send a few letters, it's going to be more expensive to do it. I hope that makes it clear. I mean, do you agree that it seems to me that, or do you agree that we oftentimes disagree on that particular point, how much intervention there should be by the government in those areas?
I'd say that's fair. My feeling on it is that there should be a certain baseline that is maintained, and that sometimes it means that those with more means, or with that live in an area where it's more convenient or things are simpler, they end up paying uh, more than it would normally cost in order to help subsidize the people that for which it's a little bit more difficult, which there might be a little more struggle with, or there's less convenience. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think there's a danger there. Just in general, I'm a libertarian. I don't feel that government should be done away with, because I don't want anarchy, and I don't feel that, and I feel like it does a lot of good, the government. But I feel like it has a tendency to overstep, and to do too much. And I think a lot of that's where a lot of the problems that I have with government come from, is many times I think it's good intentions, but I think they begin to gather too much power, too much regulation in general. And so anything I can do to say we should minimize the influence of government, I think is important. And these things might seem small. Well, hey, why not provide an opportunity? for for people that live in a poor area that where there's not a lot of people to send mail every which way for just as cheaply as you could if you lived in a more populated area. Or maybe, wouldn't it be nice if everybody in these poor areas had the same internet as people in the wealthy areas? But I don't think government's a good decision maker in that regard, because with all central planning, at times there are mistakes or inefficient use of means, of funds, of tax dollars, and so I'd prefer to let the free market uh, come in and eventually, it might take a while, but eventually provide those services where it can. We talked about internet years ago. You and I talked about internet and how it wouldn't be available to these areas and how could it be provided because these people are so far removed from everything. And it's not a perfect system because it takes a while to get there. But now Starlink is providing that service. They're getting better and better at it, I guess, providing that service because they're putting satellites all over the world, and they're going to be able to provide internet to rural parts of America, to Africa, to Southeast Asia, all parts of the world. So for me, we should always just wait for the free market to catch up and provide those services.
Okay, so do me a favor now and walk this back around to the pursuit of happiness. How are the two connected?
Because when we talk about, you and I have that discussion about whether or not those services should be provided by the government, I would say no. I think if we use that phrase from Thomas Jefferson as a guide to what government should do is provide life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then we make the justification that it should be doing those sorts of things by saying, well, that's to help us to achieve our pursuit of happiness. However, happiness, I guess the distinction that I'm making is that happiness can't be provided by the government. It's only the opportunity for the pursuit of it. And so I think you and I should be careful when we think about these things, or at least understand why we have these differences. Yeah, it would be a nice thing if the government could provide all these types of things. But most of that pursuit of happiness should come from us pursuing it and not from the government just doling it out or giving it to people.
Okay, so not necessarily a disagreement of what you're saying, but I think it is helpful to go back and look at the original document and to recognize that the Declaration of Independence is not the framework on which the government is built. The Declaration of Independence was a declaration, sort of like a mission statement, where Thomas Jefferson and a bunch of other people that were here in the United States, or what became the United States, said, "Hey, we've got issues with our present system of governance. We're not happy with it. And here is sort of our philosophical challenge. Here's where we're struggling with our present form of government." And so he lays out that this basic set of rules. And of course, when you and I had a brief conversation about the statement, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you and I were in agreement that life and liberty are fairly clear cut in terms of how a government should protect or promote those two aspects. But with pursuit of happiness, it's a little more complex. And I think the application or the understanding about it being a mission statement of sorts makes it a little bit more understandable as to why it was there. Because the other thing is that the pursuit of happiness, never shows up in any of our government legal documents. There's no laws around it. The closest that I could find is in the 14th Amendment that says, in part, nor shall any state deprive any persons of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So in no place is there reference to a pursuit of happiness. And so what is the obligation of a government to allow for the pursuit of happiness? And again, this comes back to the idea that, Thomas Jefferson putting forth that pursuit of happiness is something that people should be, we want to strive towards, that we believe that this right is so powerful that he called it unalienable. Um, uh, the An unalienable right endowed by the Creator that is due to all people, not just in Americans. Because if you believe this right is unalienable, then it should apply beyond the boundaries of our country, and that we should be promoting and encouraging the pursuit of happiness everywhere around the world. Because if it is unalienable by the Creator that we have, not that it's really applicable here, but I think it's an interesting little side note in terms of our global presence. It's also worth noting, and this was something, there's a guy named Arthur Schlesinger, and he wrote a book called The Lost Meaning of the Pursuit of Happiness. And he said that when, at the time of the Declaration's composition, the pursuit of happiness did not mean chasing or seeking, but actually practicing happiness, the experience of happiness. So that happiness wasn't necessarily an end goal, but we all should be, according to the document as it was written and the understanding at that time, living a life that contained happiness. Now, all that really doesn't address what you were talking about with respect to the post and what was the other one you mentioned? Utilities. But before we go into that, do you have anything you want to say about what I just said? I was talking for quite a bit.
Can you hear me, Brian? Brian,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
I can hear barely. You're a little weak. Not physically.
Yeah, I said so. It was the post office and the internet, but I think that's a good assessment of it. But yeah, what are your thoughts on how we disagree in those areas?
Well, I think that an aspect of governance is a social contract. And the social contract says that we all are, we all share an identity, almost like a family, that you didn't choose your brothers or your sisters, but they are part of your family. And so there is a social contract that's there. And those social contracts can be broken when things go horribly wrong, when criminals behave so badly that they need to be removed from society for a period of time. We understand that's part of the social contract. Your contract with your siblings, if they behave so badly that you can you take a break, you can make a break with them. But in most circumstances, we have the social contract. And I feel like part of that social contract is that we maintain a certain baseline of living. And so that is why I feel like those with a little more are obligated, sometimes forced, to support those with a little bit less. And part of when the postal service was put into place, it was seen as a social need, a government need, not so that necessarily you or I could mail a letter to our sibling in some other city, but because the government had need from time to time to be able to get information to the public. And sometimes that happened through newspapers, sometimes there were other means that it happened. And so they had to have a system in place so that when those moments came about, they could get that information out there. One of the ways, or one of the types of information that was much more important at an earlier time to get out there were things like death notices, legal contracts. Those had to be posted publicly, and one place they would be posted is in the newspaper. And so there was this need that people have access to certain information, government information, legal information, and then news being a nice side effect. And so that's one of the reasons why we have the post.
Not necessary anymore, obviously, but so not an argument pertaining to what we're talking about, but
the need for information is still out there, but there's different means. Sure. And so if we take that same idea and say, okay, we need to make sure people have access to certain information. Another method they might have would be perhaps the internet. And so then we need to make sure that, again, that baseline is met so that people have access to the internet. Now, one of the things you mentioned a few moments ago was that you thought the private industry was a better way to handle that. And you mentioned Elon Musk's Earthlink, is that what he called it?
Starlink.
Starlink. And that's an interesting example because some news came out, I want to say a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago, where the Ukraine has been utilizing his Starlink system a lot in their war with Russia. And the story came out where the Ukrainians were getting ready to start a surprise attack on some Russian naval ships. And according to the story, it hasn't been verified yet. According to the story, Elon Musk was not happy that his internet was being used that way, and he shut it down. And it thwarted the attack on the Russian ships. So now you have an individual private citizen deciding who has and does not have access to the internet and how they're allowed to use it.
Well, I think that happens all over the place. Yeah, maybe we should just give it all to government and let government decide who gets to use it and who wins wars. And I mean, like that problem that you're illustrating, I think that could be a problem anywhere. I mean, like in in a lot of countries, the government makes all those decisions, and there's no private firms that can provide opportunities. And I don't know, I'd have to read that story. I think almost everything well, not almost everything, a lot of what is written about Elon Musk, he has a different take on what actually happened. So I'd have to research that one. But I think it's cool that he provided a service that people in Ukraine can use. Even though a lot of their infrastructure was taken out, he provided them an opportunity to have access to that they wouldn't otherwise have had. I live out on the coast of Oregon, and here I use Starlink at my business, and it's the best internet service that I have available to me. So I think it's cool that it's become so prevalent that in so many parts of the country and of the world, people have access to that they wouldn't otherwise have.
True. And now I wonder how much of the infrastructure that was built out with the Starlink system was supported by government grants.
Some of it was. Yeah, maybe they should. I'd be fine if they didn't provide that. Is there a point there or a question, or are you just trying to
Well, just a
needle?
comment that the necessity of government for a lot of Elon Musk's ventures. He got some pretty good loans for Tesla. I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but then I'm also recognizing that I'm drawing the conversation off topic. So go ahead and respond, and then we'll pull it back onto the.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk about that too. And Elon Musk has said himself, like, as long as you provide, he goes, yeah, I think he disagrees with it, but if the money's there, he's going to use it. In the same way that if I disagree with all the tax cuts that we have, because I think it needlessly increases the complexity of our tax codes, I'm not going to ignore them. If I can avoid paying a couple $1,000s in taxes or take some child tax credits, I'll take them. But I might not agree with every tax break that is given. I think it needlessly makes things more complex. But if they're there, of course, I'll take them. And to say, well, it wouldn't have happened or it was necessary for his companies. I don't know that that's the case. It maybe made things easier and sped things up. Maybe that was good. Maybe it wasn't. I think that's what the government does. On the one hand, they're subsidizing solar power and renewables, and on the other hand, they're subsidizing oil companies. On the one hand, they're subsidizing solar power. On the other hand, they're charging tariffs and making it more expensive when people bring solar panels into this country. So I think that's what the government does. They tend to have a lot of weird incentives all over the place that contradict each other, but I don't think that negates the fact that those companies have done some good, I don't think it tells us that they wouldn't be here if not for those grants.
Yeah, I mean, as far as taking advantage of the government grants or government incentives wherever they occur, I do agree with you. I do agree with you. I'm not going to pay more in taxes by neglecting certain tax breaks. I'm going to take advantage of any tax break the government offers without a doubt. So I do agree with that aspect. Uh, but to come back to the idea of the pursuit of happiness and the government's role therein, one of the things that should really be considered is what happens when one person's pursuit of happiness interferes with another's. Where does the government stand in allowing that pursuit of happiness to occur? I mean, I think a really blatantly obvious example, and one that you and I will probably agree on, is slavery. The government said that the slave owner's pursuit of happiness and the slave's pursuit of happiness are in conflict, but the government decided in that case, the slave's pursuit of happiness had a higher priority than the slave owners because you have life and liberty versus economic benefit. So the government interfered. We have other examples of, religion is a common one where, certain religious groups want to impose their belief systems through laws. Other groups want to interfere with certain religious groups by creating laws. So what happens when the government is sort of put in as an arbiter to decide which rights there are more valuable? And I'll give you an example to let you debate it. We have, let's say, modesty laws where maybe a woman wants to go walk around town topless because of her freedoms, and then you have a devout conservative or maybe a Muslim who feels women should be covered modestly from neck to ankle. That we have two conflicting beliefs there. Which one gets precedence?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, and many times we go right to that one. Well, girls, we make them cover up or something like that. But there are laws that you can't walk around with your pants off. And I think we're all okay with that one. So at some point, we're going to find, I mean, everybody I don't, well, I guess not everybody. Most everybody has a line where they say, I want some level of modesty. For some people, it's much more conservative than others. So yeah, I think it's a great point, and something that I think many times when people talk about those modesty laws, for example, about women breastfeeding or something like that, or not even a law, just a norm, a societal norm where people say, yeah, I think women should always be covered up when they're breastfeeding, and other people say, listen, it's a natural thing. It's just a breast. It doesn't matter. And so we disagree on it, and that's fair. I totally get it. But there is a line in that I don't know if it's morality or just a social construct or a norm, but where all of us, or almost all of us, have a norm or a line somewhere that we don't want to have crossed. We don't want to walk around, uh, beaches and have them be completely nude beaches, most of us. Or, we wouldn't be okay with, a set of parents coming to an elementary school to pick up their kids being totally naked. So we need to find where people do feel comfortable. And I think I mean, we sometimes, maybe, I guess, morality is included in that many times, but frankly, a lot of that has to do with just what society's norms are, what we're comfortable with. Indigenous people, they didn't have the same norms that we have. Maybe it's our Victorian ancestry or something like that, but many of us are just uncomfortable with that stuff. And I think it's justifiable in many cases for either the government or society as it's set on its own to find some way to make people feel comfortable, if that makes sense. Don't you agree?
So what I hear from you is that when the conversation around government's involvement, uh, when you feel constrained or when it costs you money, you're very resistant to it. But when you talk about like these cultural social norms, you're much more willing to I guess compromise and be willing to say, well, let society decide. Does that sound right?
No, no, I don't think that's right at all.
Okay.
I think sometimes society needs to step in those cases in both cases, or sorry, government might need to step in both cases. So I'd be fine in either case, but when money is involved, that wasn't what I was thinking at all. I'm trying to think what, I mean, maybe you heard something in what I said that made you feel that way.
Well,
Could you
taxes. We
illustrate why
talk
you feel
taxes.
like I said that? Uh-huh. We talked about taxes.
So what I'm saying is, when you are forced to pay more taxes, you feel put upon by the government. The government is overreaching and overextending, going beyond what it should, and that rubs you the wrong way. And you're
Well, I think, but a lot of the things we've talked about has to do with regulations too. Like I think
Mhm.
one of the major missteps of government in the past 50 years, as we've talked about numerous times, is nuclear power. And that hasn't been me being forced to pay more. I guess ultimately it affects our pocketbook because all those years that they were restricting the expansion of nuclear power, uh, and I think they were wrong because nuclear power has turned out to be one of the safest and one of the most efficient methods of producing power. But they've restricted us all these years, so we paid more for the climate, and so they're implementing all kinds of regulations and restrictions, and costs are higher because of these regulations that they're putting in place. But we would have had far less carbon in the environment if we had used nuclear power. So they created a problem and then are forcing us to solve it in other ways. So I don't think it's just about taxes. I think that restrictions in general are the problem. I think, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were discussing this, one example is the cake, the baker, I can't remember where he was, that he was, the government they were trying to get the government to force him to make cakes for, that said certain things or that, force certain people, and he was resistant to doing it. He didn't want to have to put, I can't remember what it was, if it was a gay wedding, and he didn't want to have to put two men on the cake because of his religious beliefs. So does government step in and say, hey, yeah, you have to do that. You have to make a cake for those people and maybe put a message on it that you don't want to, even if it you don't believe in those things and you don't want to do it, then we're going to force you to do it. So that's not then levying extra taxes. It's forcing him to do something that he doesn't feel comfortable with.
Sure. Now, related to that, there was a news came down yesterday that the woman in one of the southern states who was denying marriage licenses to same-sex couples because of her religious beliefs, she was just required to pay $260,000 in legal fees. Now, of course, she was a government official. She wasn't a private uh, business person. Um,
$260,000. That seems pretty punitive.
well, it could have been. I don't know if it was
That's
punitive or
crazy.
if it was to cover legal fees.
Well, whether or not it's to cover legal fees, it's punitive to her in the sense that it's a punishment that she has to pay them.
Well, and it's punitive to them if she doesn't pay their legal fees.
Whose legal fees was it?
The couple that had sued her for denying them the marriage license.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that story. That sounds really crazy to me. In that case, I think we both agree as a government official, if the rule is that the government provides marriage licenses, she should provide them. She has no right to deny them. And if she doesn't like it, she should quit the job and get something else. Somebody in a private business who doesn't want to provide a service, that also seems crazy to me that he should be forced to do something that he feels uncomfortable with.
So it's your feeling is based on essentially that if we use that married couple or the couple that wanted to get married as the example, their ability to pursue their happiness, their ability to live in their happiness was being impeded by this government official. Um, what about in the case where this couple then is looking to get a cake for their wedding and they can't find anyone that'll make a cake for them?
Yeah, this is exactly it. This is kind of what this is where I think we diverge so much, and this was, I think, the point of the conversation. It just seems so odd to me how at times you'll say, they can't pursue happiness unless they can get the cake that they want. And I'll say, well, they could just go make their own or buy it from somebody else, or maybe they can't have a cake. Sometimes we can't get the things that we want. And it doesn't seem wise in any way for us to say, well, the government should ensure that they get a cake by making sure that this particular guy makes it for them. That's such an odd statement. You know, in a free market, and I think what the government should provide is, hey, any service that you want to provide, you can provide it. Any service that you want to buy from somebody who's offering it, you can buy it. But we're not going to force you to buy something that you don't want to, and we're not going to force you to do something that you don't want to do. They can't do in the same way that, if the government came down and said, well, we don't have enough bakers in the world, we're gonna have to look at all of you, or in our country, we're going to look at all of you and decide, hey, Colin and Brian, we need you both to be bakers so that enough people can get the wedding cakes that they want. I mean, and it's such an odd concept. I don't understand at all why these people should have to be provided a wedding cake in the way that they want from this particular person.
Okay, so I mean, I do agree with you in the respect that a wedding cake is fairly trivial in terms of someone's overall life happiness, but it does move beyond simply wedding cakes. What happens when someone is denied access to all the restaurants in town because the color of their skin doesn't match the majority of the people that live in that town?
Uh, but so you're saying that in case people, because of the color of their skin, can't go to restaurants, we need this guy to make cakes for in a way that he feels uncomfortable with. Is that the argument?
Well, it's the same concept, it's just different in degree. One is, someone's celebration, a one-day event where they want to have a lot of friends. Another one, the other one is fairly intrusive in terms of someone's ability to live their life.
Ability to live their life because they can't go to restaurants as
Well, of
much to live
course,
their
the
life.
restaurant is just one aspect, but if you are not allowed to go into any business because you're black, and there have been places where, you had to use the back entrance. If you remember the movie Driving Miss Daisy, where the woman that was being driven around, the white woman was able to go inside the building to use the bathroom. The black driver had to go and find a tree back in the woods to go and pee behind because he wasn't allowed to use the bathroom. I mean, that is uncomfortable, but after a while, that could become extremely uncomfortable. And in fact, there's people that have died from such a thing.
Yeah, and I would say though that in almost all, well, I know this is a controversial take, and you and I are going to disagree on this one, but to me, um, I would let society work that out for itself and not enforce those rules because I see that's that almost all of those problems that we came up with or that you were discussing, there were laws in place to enforce them. And why did there have to be laws in place to enforce them? Was because it's tempting if you own a restaurant and there's a whole segment of society that is not being provided for, it's tempting to provide for them. If I was in a town where uh, there was a whole segment of the population, whether it was black, white, or any race, and they were not allowed to go into restaurants, and I can open up a restaurant, and all of them would come to my restaurant, it would be tempting not to do that. I mean, restaurants struggle all the time. So they are not in the business typically of avoiding huge segments of the population. And if they do, then somebody else steps in and provides for it. And when you talk about all those things that happened, there were laws throughout the South that restricted people from drinking from the same water fountains, from doing all these different types of things. It was government that most of the time was necessary to be able to enforce those rules. And it's just as likely that, well, it's probably more likely that government is going to impose rules that are deemed to be discriminatory than for people to do it en masse because at some point somebody else is going to offer that product. I mean, even the red lines that happen in the banks, those were government enforced. All these things, I think, we act as if government needs to solve the problem. Many times it was government that was causing it.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I'll make my final statement, and then you can do the same. Um, Many times you're correct that government is complicit in some of the um, the abuse of humanity that occurs. Like you say, down in the South, there were local regulations that allowed the segregation to occur. The difference, in my opinion, is that it's easier for people to change government rules than it is to wait for the marketplace to reset itself. Because sure, eventually the marketplace will reset, but if we use slavery as the example, from the foundation of this country, it took 200 years for slavery and for the segregation to be removed through government efforts. And it was always, it can, unless you get enough local people that are willing to influence the market is going to continue with the status quo.
Yeah, I think that's a great example that you give of slavery, except of course I see it exactly the opposite. It was only government that was allowing slavery to exist. I mean, if the country was established in 1776 and slavery was abolished in 1864 or 65, then that's 100 years or so. But throughout that whole time, it was government that was not providing liberty. And it was government that had to be changed, not the free market. And if you look at the South, where Black people couldn't go to certain restaurants and things like that, it was only because there weren't enough Black-owned restaurant owners that could provide that service. If everybody was allowed to have whatever restaurant they wanted, then there would have been plenty of places for people to go and eat. It was government that was restricting Black ownership and Black opportunity in those areas. And I think that's typically the problem, because the free market does respond pretty well and provide opportunities to people. You'd have to have, a Black person in a town where there's nobody else that's Black or something like that, and everybody else happens to be racist, which in this day and age is just not a common occurrence. So I think the government steps in and causes more problems than they cause. And when we look at the things that they did in years past, it's been them solving the problems that they themselves created. Or, we through government are solving the problems that we through government created.
Well, we're pretty much out of time. I would like to point out that when you say government as if some external entity, remember that we are also part of the government, and we can be if we just choose to get involved with it.
Well, that was my last point, that we as
What?
the government are solving problems that we as the government created. That was the last thing that I said.
Well, I'm gonna have to leave it there because we're basically out of time. Um, so we'll talk offline about what our next conversation is to be.
Okay.
Talk to you later, Colin. We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.